All right, welcome everybody. My name is Jason Haddix. I am the field CISO for Flare, and today we're gonna do a presentation, second version of a talk that I've done over the past couple of years called Tales from the Breach, which is my experience and my journey through battling some, you know, pretty advanced threat actors at some of my previous jobs. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, kind of what happens when you're in the seat, what I learned over my tenure in that kind of seats. What were the learnings that I got from a whole bunch of survey that I did with with other CISOs and security leaders, and then my transition into red teaming and using those tactics and refining them in the same way that an adversary was. And so I turned it into a red team methodology when I was red teaming for the past couple of years. And so we'll talk all about that. But thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it for everyone who could make it out and for everybody who in the future might watch a recording or anything like that. So I'll go ahead and get started. So the first part of this presentation, I like to start off um, with kind of a story that's near and dear to everyone's heart. And it's a video. And if you've ever worked, on the defensive side of security, you will have felt, a lot of these feels when I do this. I don't know if the audio is going to come through, so I'm going to try to narrate you guys the computer audio from my computer. So we'll see how this goes. And yeah, let's watch our little video clip now. Okay, so this is a common story, a tale as old as time. So here we have a threat actor who's landed on a network, and we have our security analysts who, are protecting the network, and our threat hunters, and our basically our threat actor has some creds and has got
The
initial
snake's eyes
access,
aren't very good,
and we have our SOC
but they can
team
detect movement.
who has detected a little bit of something going on
So if the
fishy, like
hatchling kinks
an
its
improbable
nerve, it
login
may
from a
just
place it
avoid
shouldn't be.
detection.
The attacker, who is the lizard here, is oh, do they have antivirus? And the answer is yes, but the attacker is going to attempt to move with credentials throughout the network, drop other people's credentials, start moving. So the SOC is on to the attacker, and now it's time for the attacker to start to run. Right, so incident response is on the case, and they're disabling compromised accounts. They're following up on leads. Threat intel has not got now gotten involved, and here's the whole security team coming to try to grab the threat actor. Now, threat actor is on the run. Detection engineering has built a rule, and it has basically found the threat actor and is trying to stop it throughout the network. But our threat actor has another account and is off to the holy grail, which is the domain controller. So we have our threat actor scaling the Active Directory infrastructure. You can see that uh, is bypassing XDR here, is scaling to the top, unhooking our EDR, um, and is jumping to the precipice of their goal, which is the domain controller.
A near miraculous
And
escape.
now they are there, and actually somebody else is there, a friend with them. And now SOC and all of the blue team has to go into incident
The
response
lucky
mode
survivors could begin
and
learning.
probably do a bunch of really painful post exploitation investigation and eradication. And I call this a tale as old as time because if you've worked on blue team and you fought adversaries before, you might have been through this exact situation. So I like to start it off with something a little bit funny. So that is kind of something that maybe you've been through similarly, and I have been through as well in my term as a CISO. So this talk is kind of about that story, but my personal story. It's got a little bit of red teaming in this talk, a little bit of blue teaming information, and really just a lot of tips and tricks, which tends to be a lot of my talks. My history is I was a red teamer for the first 15 years of my career. So offensive security person in some fashion, bug bounty, red team, pen test, you name it, I've done it. And then I transitioned to leadership, in which I was a CISO and on the blue team. And so I managed my program very much based on my experience as a red teamer. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But in this talk, there's both blue team and red team information. But hopefully it'll, you'll pull out of it some nuggets from my experience, or you'll just feel a shared experience of camaraderie with someone, with someone who's probably been through some of the same things that you have. So this presentation starts in 2021 and 2022. And at this time, I was a CISO of a multinational organization with 22,000 employees. And it was a hot target for threat actors. Now, we went up against a threat actor called Lapsus, which was a bunch of kids from many areas, but some resided in Great Britain, some resided in South America, etc. And Lapsus was a bunch of young people, but don't let anyone fool you into thinking that just because they were young, they were not talented. If you look at the logos on this screen, and this is not even all of them, this is only a subsection that were found out. There were several others that are not on here. They breached some really, really, really big companies. And so they did this through a combination of tips and tricks, knowing the Microsoft ecosystem very well, social engineering. They're very, very good. And so what I think is kind of rough is you'll see a lot of people talk about this attack or this adversary group, and they'll downplay it because they were young. And believe me, I know some of the best hackers in the world from the bug bounty scene, and they are also young, and they also find critical vulnerabilities in big networks. So this is the threat actor that we faced, and you can see there's like Microsoft on here, and T-Mobile, and Okta, and stuff like that. And so we basically had an encounter with this threat actor in the 2021-2022 timeline. Now, what happened is we had our, basically encounter with this threat actor. And I was really frustrated because I had come from the world of red teaming. I had a healthy budget for my security team. We had all of the bells and whistles and products that you would want as a security team, and we still got breached. And so when the dust had settled from the breach, and during the eradication, a lot of my job was to figure out kind of what happened, why with sizable security investment and some epic staff, what happened to us, happened to us. And so what I did is, obviously in these memes, I am Tony Stark, and I went out and reached out to my network of other security leaders and security CISOs at other places, a lot of places that had been breached, some places that hadn't been breached but had been attacked by the same threat actor. I know a lot of people, and I was able to call them and be like, okay, well, what happened? What did we miss? And so that's what this presentation is a collection um, of my reach out and my personal experience to or my reach out to other people and my personal experience. And so my friends here are represented by the Iron Legion, which are the other CISOs. And yeah, so we'll talk about kind of the learning experience. Okay, so let's talk about initial access for adversaries. So initial access is a term that gets thrown around a lot in when people are talking about adversaries, and then it's also a term that gets thrown around a lot in pen testing and red teaming. And what happened when I surveyed everybody, and my personal experience is, COVID in those years that we were just coming out of COVID caused a massive work from home transition that still exists to this day. So this is still a problem to this day. Parts of this problem are still a problem. And so sending all of our staff home, a lot of companies were not prepared for that transition, because what it meant was that employees used their own hardware at home, their own personal laptops to start working. And even if you were a company at that time that transitioned your whole workforce to work from home, a lot of times you couldn't even, if you had the budget, you couldn't even afford, or you couldn't buy the laptops from your laptop manufacturer like Dell or HP or something like that, because they were just back ordered because everybody else was doing the same thing. And so what happened was a lot of people had to create BYOD employees who were using their own personal laptops in order to use productivity apps on the cloud. So Slack, Office 365, managing code via GitHub or GitLab, etc. And these were all web technologies. They're all handled via the web. And so all these employees went home, and a lot of these laptops were already pre-owned by attackers, right? So people's kids had, downloaded, Fortnite or Roblox, Robux cracks, or tried to like get dollars or something like that. Some people had torrented movies. Some people had been hit by drive-by downloads. Some people had been pre-fished in their personal email accounts, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of the machines were pre-owned, and attackers already had access to them, but they weren't special until these employees started to move home and log into their corporate logins for work. So the big winners in this area for adversaries were the Office 365 suite and Slack, and we'll talk about those in a second. So in the authentication realm, basically these pre-owned machines, people started logging into their Microsoft 365 accounts, and so the attackers realized quickly that there were some very, very like nuanced ways to set up your two-factor authentication. So basically, with cookies that are set by Microsoft, the attackers, sometimes would already be logged in, and since they had control over the laptop and the user had an active cookie to their Microsoft O365 service, a lot of times they could just walk in to the control panel for the user in O365. And so what a lot of companies had at this point was they were tying authentication to their VPN to the same authentication scheme that they use for O365, which is their domain credentials, which is the user's domain credentials. And since the laptops were already pre-owned, these attackers waited for the user to use the credential, and then they had the credential. They also had the cookie for their O365 session in the web browser, and so then they had the username and password, and then they would profile the VPN login. And so they would go look at the VPN login. And if you didn't have two-factor authentication set up for the VPN login, then they could get in with the username and password that they've stolen. But a lot of times what would happen is that you'd have two-factor authentication set up for the VPN. And so what they would do is they would go into the control panel, since they had the cookie to log into the control panel for the user in Office 365, they would go in there and just add a new two-factor authentication device. So like a new phone, the attacker's phone. And then they would be able to go again to the VPN and approve the login with their own two-factor authentication device. And so this was something that at that time, changing the 2FA device, not a lot of people had granular policies set up for that, like where you could set up a two-factor when and where you could set up a new two-factor authentication device. And so this was definitely a learning that a lot of people in the previous slides learned about. So the attackers also, if they had Slack, they had the web cookie for Slack, and they could log into the Slack web version and just start chatting inside of Slack. And so they would go into Slack and start rooting around for credentials, and try to get credentials that were posted in files. And none of us have ever shared a credential in Slack before, right? So and then when they couldn't get in via those methods, rooting around in Slack or adding their own two-factor authentication device and getting in through the VPN with either the cookies or the credentials they had from the Microsoft ecosystem, then they would resort to some hybrid social engineering stuff, things like SMS bombing and social engineering. So with SMS bombing, what they would do is they would just the user would try to get into, or they would try to get into the VPN, and they would see that they had the push notice version of two-factor authentication enabled, and they would just bomb the user with 100 requests. And so the user on their phone would get like 100 pop-ups. And so eventually, they'd think either something was wrong, or there was an error, or something happened, and they would click the button and say trust, like just stop giving me these alerts, and they'd click the like two-factor authentication OK prompt, and so the attacker would get in. Now when that didn't work, and the attacker, the bombing didn't work of two-factor authentication, when that didn't work, they would resort to vishing the client, which is voice phishing. And so in one or two of the instances, they called a user, usually on a busy time in their time zone, and would say, "Hey, I am this person," and this was documented for Uber, so I'm going to use Uber as the example. But they would say, "Hey, this is Uber security. We're doing a mandatory like credential updates. We need you to click the prompt on your phone that keeps popping up." And so they actually did this via, I think they called the user in the specific instance of Uber, they called them over WhatsApp or something like that. It was crazy. And the user was like, okay. And they usually did this at a busy time so that they were kind of frantic, like on a Friday night when they were out, at dinner with their family. And so then they would vish the user and tell them to click the prompt. And that allowed them access to the VPN. Now, mainly a lot of times they were after VPN access to get to the internal network. And again, like I said, if they only had Slack access and the highest settings were set up and they couldn't vish the user and they couldn't change the two-factor authentication device, then they would just sit in Slack for a long time and look through all of the credentials and all the attachments that were in Slack until they found one that could give them further access. And so this was their kind of initial access MO. Now, once they got in, things start to get interesting, because a lot of that stuff we know about. Maybe some of the tricks that they use we knew about, but when they started to get into the internal network, once they got access to the VPN, they didn't do anything that really set off any alarm bells once they were in, for the SOC or for the blue teams. So what they did is they would visit web front ends for all of these tools like SharePoint, CMDB, Jira, Confluence, GitLab, Artifactory. So it would go to these places, and these are all web portals. And so to the SOC, this just looks like normal web traffic. And so they would go to these places and root around in them, depending on what kind of access the user credential they had would give them. And they would start looking through these places for more credentials until they could stockpile a bunch of different credentials. Now, this is a lot different than many of what the people I surveyed had experienced in kind of their red teaming world, right? So they had hired their own red team to do this type of work, to do internal penetration testing, or they had hired a third party vendor or something like that to do their internal pen testing or red teaming. And most of the time, when you do one of those engagements, those types of outfits are very AD based, and so they will have very technical methodologies once they're on the internal LAN. And this is not necessarily like a hardcore technical methodology. They're just rooting around in web apps looking for credentials to pivot and using different services. And so this differs a little bit than what a lot of people had seen their red teamers do. There's a very common list of internal red teaming tricks that people use. There was no man in the middle. There's no exploitation here. It's all credential reuse. And so this is what they did. And it was hard for the SOC to pinpoint them because this was all web traffic to everybody. So that was that adversary, and some of the things that happened during that term. So once I left, and I know I have a special experience because I've done a lot of different roles. But once I left the CISO role at that company, I went back to red teaming because offensive security is one of my loves, and I don't think I'll ever not do some form of offensive security, whether it's in my free time or it's part of my main role. And so I went back to red teaming in 2023 and 2024. Now, what I realized is that if I really wanted to emulate, a red team, or if I really wanted to emulate a real adversary, I had to mimic some of the stuff that those young hackers were doing, which was a ton of credential reuse, and I had to get really, really into kind of the dark web ecosystem, and understand how real adversaries worked, how initial access brokers worked, et cetera, because I wanted to mimic real adversaries. So I did a bunch of research on building a red team methodology that incorporated both the technical methodology and then the credential reuse methodology that many modern attackers were using. So I don't know if you've ever seen this guy. He does a fantastic like little audio clip, and it's called Wake Up," and if you haven't seen it, um, you can DM me somewhere on Twitter, or find the meme, but it's a fantastic meme. And someone posted this. I thought this was really funny. So IR teams at 2 a.m. when a new CVE drops. So in 2023 and 2024, a lot of the adversaries pivoted to or incorporated attacking devices, that dealt with either security or access on the external network to the internal network through their web portals. And so you have things that, like, we saw in 2023 and 2024. We're still seeing more of these drop to this day, but I think more than ever we found web exploits to the web components of Ivanti, Citrix, Cisco, Avanti again, Fortinet, Palo Alto Networks, a bunch of really high profile CVEs to these devices, but they were all web attacks to these web front ends for these devices, which if you could exploit them, gave you access to portions of the internal network, or credentials of users, and stuff like that. And so we've had a rough time in 2023 to 2024 on this front, combined with the threat actors who continue to use credentials that are exposed, on the dark web, that they've stolen via other things like phishing and stuff like that. So in building the red team methodology, I needed to make sure that my assumptions were right about, kind of what they were doing. And so, what I did is I started to research, kind of how threat actor groups worked, where they, kind of operated, at what levels they operated, et cetera. And so in my personal research, I came up kind of with this breakdown. And, this is from survey, this is from hanging out on dark web forums, this is from acting like an adversary on those forums and building sock puppet accounts and everything. And so a lot of hackers, on those places, are hobbyist hackers. They're not being paid by anyone to hack. They could be activists, they could be hackers because they're part of a hacking group. They could be hackers, adversaries, because they really want to hack certain things, and they're part of these small collections of, discords or telegrams of, young people who really identify with hacking and are, doing it for the lulz. Then you have about 10% of your adversaries that are career adversaries, and these are people these are people who are out there to make personal profit, and they're very advanced, and they treat it like a job, and they're in it for the money. And then about 5% of those are nation state hackers, which are backed by a financial organization of a nation. And it is their job to break into places and get initial access, and to usually perform corporate espionage or sabotage, to different places. And so this is kind of the breakdown. Now, many of you will face, you know, uh, only the 95% in here. You'll face, a lot of hobbyist hackers. You'll face a lot of career hackers, but you might never face a nation state group of adversaries. And so this talk, really does canvas that 95%. I'm not really canvassing the nation state methods, because they are way more advanced in most cases. And so um, I chose to emulate kind of the 95% rather than the last 5%. You can see kind of through a couple of surveys, actually quite a few surveys, about what this 95% is doing. And so this is just a screenshot from the Verizon breach report. And so you can see that, 40, close to 40% of all breaches are started by credentials that have been leaked or sold on the dark web. And then another close to maybe 18% lives in the land of phishing and getting access via phishing. And this is from this year's VDBIR. And then the last little bit is exploits of vulnerabilities. Now, exploits of vulnerabilities is a large category. Um, Most of this is actually web exploits, so web application exploits that lead to access in some way, and then lead to a breach. This is, the initial access vector. So this kind of already cemented my feeling as to kind of, how the 95% worked. Also, this is a 2022 study by CISO, and you can see here on the right for initial access techniques, valid accounts, meaning credentials, was one of the biggest things that was initial access. Then again, phishing, and then you have a whole bunch of small little little kind of things like access to remote services, spear phishing attachments, drive-by compromise, and then 1.4% is exploit public-facing web application. So these two studies again cemented kind of where I was going. Kaspersky did another thing like this in 2022, said almost the same thing, except for was a little bit higher on the exploit public-facing web application attacks. Um, so these started to cement my idea, and so I went to go basically emulate, these three types of, red teaming styles to emulate real adversaries. So what I did and what I do with all my research is usually I make a methodology. I work really well when I have a structured methodology. And so I started to build a mind map of kind of the levels of things that adversaries will do to get into an organization. So I ended up making this mind map for myself when when I wanted to emulate certain levels in the adversary. So I put it in levels kind of like a video game. So, or a level one of skill for an adversary would be to use credentials that are already on the public web. And so this is my research, this is things like pastebin, things that are breach dumps that make it to the public web somehow. And so you can just download these on, different sites. And that's level one. That's your level one adversary. And so they'll look through these for credentials in breach dumps, and they will try to use the usernames and passwords if they get dumped to the public somehow. And that's really level one adversary. These are the things you kind of see in services like Dehashed, or the ones that connect into certain red teaming tools called hate mail. And you have to build your own database to really have an effective um, as a red teamer, you have to build your own database here to have an effective way to search these, or subscribe to a service. Then level two of adversaries will use the dark web forum ecosystem. So this is things like Russian market, and right now the marketplace is in flux because breached went down, and so once one site goes down, another will come up, and this is also the same thing as Genesis Market was the old golden one that a lot of attackers use. That was the most prolific and easy one to access. So level two threat actors in that 95 or 95% will then go to the dark web forum ecosystem and the markets and attempt to find your employees already owned in one of those sales on those forums, and buy their credentials and their cookies there. Then you have level three threat actors who will go to an adjacent market, which is the ransomware as a service market. And so when formerly Lockbit, or depending on what you believe, Lockbit was probably one of the biggest ones for ransomware as a service. There's a whole ecosystem around ransomware companies. And part of that ecosystem is if someone doesn't pay a ransom, eventually a threat actor group like Lockbit will publish their data publicly. But before that, they have a private sale for that data that they try to, because they don't want to make no money off of it, right? Like they want to make some money off of their ransomware, and so and the data that they might have stolen should somebody not pay the ransom. And so threat actors would go to certain forums and certain connections in the ransomware as a service ecosystem and try to look through and see, well, is this company that Lockbit had ransomware, is it in the supply chain of the company I need to attack or I want to attack, or is there an attack of opportunity in here? So they would go to that ecosystem and look and maybe make a purchase here. Then in level four, you had all of these career phishing people who did career phishing campaigns or drive-by malware campaigns, and they would be managing large deployments and attacks, like casting a very wide net of attacking anybody they could with Stealer malware, and they would sell it in WhatsApp, Telegram, and Discord channels, access to huge databases. And so you had private and public versions of these channels that you could join. Some you had to be vetted to get into, some were public. And these had what's called stealer logs in them, which to verify the authenticity of their malware that they had, or to show that it was fresh, they would publish stealer logs. Sometimes they would publish their whole database for free, depending on what the ideology of the phisher or drive-by malware campaign threat actor was. And so Stealer logs were usually the freshest credentials that you could get in this level, and they were level 4, and so the attackers would go here, the adversary would go here to look for credentials for their target. Now, if they couldn't use any of those credential levels, they would then attempt to look for known exploits in web products, so web portals for infrastructure and development, and access, like VPN portals and firewalls and stuff like that. They would then attempt to use those. Now, those allowed more attribution, and they had to be very stealthy when they actually tried to exploit software, as opposed to just use a credential. Level 6, they would move on to a custom phishing campaign, either through man in the middle with a kind of tool like Evil Engine X, or a file-based delivery of a backdoored file and to get malware on a a specific person or something like that. So they would go to a custom phishing campaign. Level 7, they would have to get really technical and reverse engineer patches and build exploits for specific web apps that their client had. Um, and then at level 8 it was even more technical. They would have to build 0 days that were previously unknown at all for software that their target had. And then level 9, they had to get really involved, which is usually insider threat or corporate espionage. So this graph helped me make a mental model of how adversaries did this step by step kind of search for access to an organization. And so it's what I built my red teaming methodology on, and it worked really, really, really well. So kind of happy with how this model turned out, and so this is kind of what was the output of me doing about a year and a half of dark web, research, parsing all that data, etc. Okay, so that's kind of my research and what I did, and so now I want to break it into kind of the responding section of the talk of like, okay, well, what were some of the things that when I did this survey of all these companies and friends, what was kind of the things that stood out in defense and talking around some of these topics. So the first one was BYOD. And so a lot of companies that I talked to, they just had to pivot harder to physical machines, um, and eventually had to send those users who they sent home, who had to stay home or who never came back to the office, or if they adopted a permanent work from home situation, you had to give them a corporate machine at some point. They cannot use their own machine, because corporate machines have usually security controls on them, EDR, that can block 80% of the attacks that come through. And so for companies who didn't do that, they pivoted to virtual desktops and ensured the virtual desktops had EDR coverage for those. There was a lot more focus on IAM and PAM for user credentials that access some of these services that I talked about in the beginning of the presentation. And then what happened was a lot of people actually ended up giving stipends to their employees to install personal antivirus products, and they would make a recommendation. Again, you can't force an employee to install antivirus on their machine, but you can suggest and give them a stipend to do it if they would like, and it's totally managed by them. But a lot of times we would do, I heard of several companies, including myself, we would do research on what the best kind of prosumer or consumer antivirus was on top of Windows Defender, and then allow for a stipend to buy a license for that to help protect the user's machine if they absolutely had to use their own machine and we weren't allowed to set up our EDR on their machine. And so that has a lot to do with local laws and in some places in international countries, and so you have to be careful with that one. But that was another thing that people pivoted to. For the authentication stuff, I suggested, a lot of people move to the level that Microsoft has now also kind of made the default, which is the enter code level of 2FA. And so a lot of you who work in Microsoft, based organizations, you've seen the pop-up on the right, which, it has a map of where your login is coming from, and you have to code match. So you get a code that's in your phone, and then the um, you enter it into the pop-up to authenticate into any service that's using Microsoft as the authentication routine. And so this is much better because people can see, oh, the login is coming from Stockholm or Russia or China or something, wherever, South America. whatever, and they're like, oh, I don't usually log in to there from there, and so this is something I'm not going to accept, even if I get bombed with it over and over and over again. So this is the level of authentication that I suggested for most people. This was only available in certain levels of Microsoft security subscription, but now it is enabled. It is available for everyone. Also, on the blue team side, we would prioritize impossible travel alerts a little bit more than we had been doing before. Tuning Microsoft Defender for Identity in all of its incarnations, we had to kind of revamp, what we were doing for new two-factor authentication devices being added. And then the tip that came from a guy named Jose Reyes, and when we were talking about this on Twitter, was um, you can set up MFA registration from trusted networks, or you can set up MFA registration from anywhere and then remove access to set it up after a certain amount of after a certain amount of days, 30 days in this case, so that they're only trusted for a temporary session. And the only way that they can open up that again is if they call help desk or something like that. So these were policies that a lot of people set up. Um, Again, a guy in the thread, John Helsinki, said, so detect when a new MFA device is added from an unusual location, and you'll need IP enrichment, which Microsoft gives you now, and then you can't just require MFA registration, so 2FA or MFA registration from a trusted location, and create a conditional access policy to require it from a location market as a trusted network. And so a lot of people ended up just doing this. So they're just like, okay, so if it's a personal network they have, used before, like their home Wi-Fi or something like that, and they need to register a new MFA device. A lot of people went with this half usability, half security kind of style here. This isn't to say that the attacker, since they have access, if they have gotten access to the laptop, they couldn't have just registered a new MFA device from the employee's laptop, which is on the Wi-Fi. They could have routed like that new registration for a new MFA through their computer, but it takes a lot more effort for them to do that. And so if you wanted to go the more hardcore method, you do the only access to add MFA for 30 days when calling, IT or something like that. So a lot of people, instead of software-based MFA or 2FA, went FIDO. So YubiKeys or other FIDO. And there's a bunch of like it's easier said than done saying, hey, roll out FIDO, especially in a big organization. And so a friend of mine, Clint Gibbler, did this amazing thread where he collected a set of blog posts and um, a whole bunch of great conversation ensued in this Twitter thread about actually rolling out YubiKeys or FIDO. And so there's like 6 or 7 articles here of different people on their journey, and they write whole articles about how it didn't integrate with certain systems that they needed it to, and what they had to do to get around those problems. And the biggest advice on this was that after parsing a lot of this, it's that you're going to end up rolling out FIDO phased on different levels of crown jewel kind of software that you have that's external, and then to your vast user base, and then to other things. And there's going to be a portion of things that will never be FIDO controlled, so you'll have to have a backup plan for those. And these are some really tremendous resources that are could be their own presentation. So I put the link for Clint's whole conversation in the bottom left there around like how you actually roll out FIDO for your organization and the tips and tricks there. The other one that not a lot of people I had talked to had talked about is this idea of secrets management being a core part of your security policy. And so when I talked about earlier about like the earlier kind of lapsus hackers, is they didn't do anything like the red team did, where they did technical exploits on the internal. Once they got access, they really just looked for credentials in different places. And so what that means is that none of us are really great at the whole topic of secrets management. Meaning, I talked to a ton of CISOs and like what they were doing around protecting secrets in different areas. And so I built a program that looked like this. It may speak to you, it may not, but we broke down secrets management into 4 pillars: detect, prevent, respond, and educate. And so in the detect portion of a secrets management program, which I had to spin up a new team for, it's a whole team around detecting, um, secrets using regex and different tools like get secrets. And there's open source tools and there's closed source tools that will identify secrets in different places, whether it's Confluence, whether it is a source code repo, whether it is whatever. But in your software, you're going to have a lot of hard coded keys, certificates, credentials, and stuff like that. So first, you have to detect them, and stop the bleeding. The next section of the program was prevent them from ever getting committed in the first place. So for code, using pre-commit hooks to stop developers from pasting in credentials or putting in hard code credentials into code, telling them to use something like Vault, or some other technology. So that was in our respond phase. So you can't just prevent them and detect all the stuff they're doing bad. You have to give them an option. So we chose a Vault technology, and then with our Vault technology, created a cred rotation policy with that Vault technology. So those, creds would get rotated every 30, 60, 90 days or whatever. And then we had to go on an education tour because some of these tools only focused on code, or they could only do a couple places we were looking for secrets. But we found a lot of, wikis and other things that housed code, or that housed text that people would put passwords into. And so we had to go on a whole training roadshow about talking about secrets management and not doing those things, and build web apps or use the Vault technology to share secrets between developers when that needed to happen or something like that. And so we created a whole security team to handle this topic, and it was one of the most important topics. And many other CISOs that I've talked to have used this template to go forward in the future, like building a team like this. So things you're looking for in a secrets management program is traditional Windows creds, API keys, SaaS usernames and passwords, and certificates are usually the big hitters that get hard coded or shared, in different places. And so these are the same things the attackers will look for. These are the things that you're looking to protect in, their various places that they get put. Um, so when I was doing my red teaming, I ran into a couple of really awesome pen testers at a conference called Hack RedCon, and I just happened to stop into their training, and it was one of the best trainings I had taken of the year. And they did a training on attacking, as red teamers, DevOps pipelines with the same methodology that I had seen real attackers using. And so they had this list. And I talked to a couple of them, and they called the methodology that like modern threat actors use, which they don't do any technical stuff. They just do the credential hunting and leverage other systems in different ways to pivot on your internal network. They called it a browser and a dream, the browser and the dream methodology, which I thought was amazing. And so this is kind of a checklist of places they had built this methodology out. I had some of it, and so I combined our stuff. And so these are the places most often that attackers will look for on your internal network, to attack the web GUI portions of these software. So knowledge bases like SharePoint, Confluence, MediaWiki, DocuWiki, Notion, TikiWiki, Wiki.js, dev and project management, places like Jira, Trello, Redmine, source code management like Git, GitHub, GitLab, etc., your repo management, your build servers, your dev platforms, your configuration management platforms, your operations and monitoring platforms, your IIC platforms, and your secrets managing platforms. All of these places, um, the front ends of them are usually web apps, and they have web app exploits if you're not updating them commonly. They have authentication bugs that, you either could have a misconfiguration, or the user that they're in there already has access to some of these things. If they have like a developer credential, if that an adversary has stolen. And so these places have to become places that you protect on your internal network. And a lot of times people don't apply a lot of security to some of these places, because they're managed directly by development. So security doesn't get involved in a big organization in some of the stuff like configuration management or stuff like that. And so, but these are where modern attackers are attacking these days. Um, Also, some research that I did over the past year too was that all of us, who, or all of you who are working in big organizations are also looking to push and use AI internally. And so that means your developers are working on LLM stacks basically to train data, or post-train data to work with a model, something like that. So some of the biggest open source tools around AI are MLflow, H203, Ray, XGBoost, and Copilot implementations. And so on top of the dev infrastructure that I talked about in the other slide, I now look for these web apps too on the internal, because they are connected to all of your training data, which is like the holy grail for an attacker. Some of these new apps in the AI world that your developers are running internally to manage training data or to build your own models, they don't even have authentication. Like literally, you just go to use the tool and it's hooked up to all your data or your databases, and there's no authentication. Other times, these apps are very new and they have very easy to exploit web application bugs. There's been several of them that have been, I think there's been like 25 of them across these, at least first three platforms. In the last 6 months, web app bugs. So these are new places that I look for also in red teaming when I get to the internal network. So for the exposure management part of like the credentials that attackers use, as a red teamer, I had to basically build a database of all those levels of credentials, like 1 through 4 in that leveling we were talking about for adversaries. And so for a red teamer to build that, it's a lot of work. Now, you can do it. It's not impossible to do it. And there's a whole bunch of um, public web sites and some GitHub sites that track the newest breaches and data breaches that happen. They don't host the data on GitHub. What they do is they give you the torrent link. And so there's a HackX Underground torrent file listing, which is a great place to start to build your database of leaked creds. It can be valuable. You get emails from this and you get, possible passwords. You can build password lists out of this. And then, if the company, after they've been breached, doesn't roll all the credentials, maybe you'll get super lucky and find one in there that still works. But this is a lot of work to create this. There is a repo called Deep Dark CTI, which then for the, one of the next levels is where are all these Telegram channels that I'm talking about? Where are all these forums that I'm talking about live? Well, this repo Deep Dark CTI tries to the best of their ability, track all of the at least open and even some of the closed telegrams and forums that exist on the dark web. And so they'll give you the torrent links here, and then it's up to your CTI team to build sock puppet accounts, infiltrate those forums, and keep up to date on whether your company's credentials end up in those forums. So if you want a listing of forums, Deep Dark CTI has a /forum section there, and it's relatively kept up, but it's also really hard to do. Then if you want Telegram and Discord channels, mostly Telegram, they have a section on Deep Dark CTI that exists for Telegram channels. And so you can grab the Telegram links for some of these groups. This one is hard to keep up on because they go up and down. Unless you live in this CTI world where you're keeping track of the, kind of the dark web groups that, come up and down. It's really hard to keep this fresh, but they do a decent job of some of them there. So you can get this from that repo, Deep Dark CTI. Now, at some point doing this, you realize as a red teamer, it's like, hey, that's a lot of work. This is a full-time job for probably 2 to 3 people to get this deep into make sure your creds aren't being leaked on the dark web. And so I had to go out and really look at the landscape of, like, is there someone that could do this at the level that I want it done at? I want that level 3 and level 4 data. I want, a provider to help me with this and do the databasing. I wanted a provider to help me to do this, to get to that level of Stealer log data. And the one that I happened to stumble on kind of randomly was Flare. And so the reason why I am the field CISO of Flare is because it was my preferred vendor of choice for this problem. And I needed this for red teaming. So Flare is relatively, easy to set up. They had a free trial. I looked through the data set of one of my customers, and then I was like, okay, they are in here with Stealer logs. This seems to be the best collection I have seen for all of the levels, really, and it's easily searchable. So in my red teaming, I subscribed to Flare. And then luckily enough, I worked with the Flare team really closely, and they were like, "Hey, when I was, leaving my last red teaming job, they're like, 'Hey, do you want to come work with us?'" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And so, now I'm the field CISO, but it was born out of this was the best vendor for this job. And so 5 out of the 6 of my last red team engagements, some form of access in my red team engagements was based on credentials out of the Stealer log section of Flare. And so that's really, like I could have continued that job of maintaining a database by myself, maintaining those sock puppets. And I still use those to understand kind of the attacker ecosystem, but this is way easier for me to do as an offensive security person is just to use Flare. And then as a defensive security person, it's a really easy way to, kind of figure out where your leaked credentials are on the dark web, all the way down to that level 4 data that you want to get to. So I ended up going through Flare to do a lot of this. So in the architecture section, really it was a lot of things we talk about but never fully get to as defensive practitioners. So we started adding jump hosts for critical IT infrastructure, web apps, and security products. So think of your VMs, your all of your EDR management, even your Splunk. Like regular users should not be able to hit those internal IPs. They should either need a jump host or additional network segmentation and access to get access to those web apps that control those really sensitive crown jewel web applications. And then one of the things that Lapsus was really particular on is with a couple of their breaches when they really wanted to bring down the company is attacking their VMware infrastructure and the VMware infrastructure API. And so there's certain calls that um, you can make to the API just to delete and shut down without recoverable backups machines on your in your VM infrastructure. And so we removed access to some of those APIs from VMware. We just shut them down at the web app level. So we ended up doing that because that was an MO for them just to kind of shame people. For the external infrastructure stuff, like the Fortinets, the Avantis, the Palo Altos, the Ciscos, like all those CVEs we talked about earlier, those live on the external, and you can wrap CDN WAFs around these to prevent very general web attacks. It makes it a little bit harder, but really at the end, you have to add secondary authentication methods to access these web portals, even to access their login, because otherwise people are just going to get to there and it's going to be a field day. It's hard to do on your VPN login, web login, but for your firewalls, for everything else, add secondary authentication methods to these systems. Other tips from my journey, know your local FBI office field number and email address. Contact them when you get hit by a threat actor. You're not the only one going through this kind of stuff. I found it tremendously helpful to do this reach out to other CISOs who I knew the threat actor was attacking to. Luckily, my threat actor was very vocal about what they were doing, so I could figure out, what other companies, and I got in touch with those CISOs. We shared threat intel and TTPs for the threat actor, and that helped us tremendously. After it was all done, tabletop scenarios for similar things that were happening became mandatory quarterly, even more than quarterly if you can afford it. Tabletop both with your technical people and your executive management so that next time there's a breach, everybody is ready and knows what to do. And then we added, as a small tip, we added SaaS and supply chain people who we knew were in our supply chain or SaaS products we use. We added credential threat hunting to our bug bounty program. So if a bug bounty hunter found a credential that was valid and worked, that was our criteria for us or one of our partners, we would pay them for it. And then contact, our partner or the person in our supply chain because we didn't want that stuff to hit the dark web. Um, One of the things I didn't talk about earlier, which I should have, is the very controversial uh, decision that when we did the reauthentication we went back through our authentication methods, and I talked to multiple people who ended up doing this. Is that what we found from our research was that when a credential is leaked from stealer malware from an employee, it takes roughly about 24 hours for it to hit the dark web sale ecosystem. It can take less with people who do automated stuff, but usually it was around 24 hours before anyone else could see it or buy it. That was the rough time. And so what we did in our Microsoft ecosystem is we actually have made the very unpopular decision to make everybody re-log in once a day and nuke the current session cookie for their Microsoft login. So every day when you came to work, you had to log in again. It's not like a week-long session that you could just continue going to the Office 365 suite and we would kill their cookie and they'd have to re-authenticate it once a day for all of the web stuff. And for the mobile stuff, since it was more of a protective enclave, we would let those sessions last a week. And so that was incredibly unpopular as a security program, but saved us in many scenarios. When something did get leaked, we had already rotated the cookie and the cred, or the cookie had already been rotated. So if a cookie got sold, it was ineffective. And then we could use our other defensive tips if we saw a password reuse or something like that. So that was something I should have said in the earlier slides. But so that is my story. Hopefully, out of my story and my journey, you learned something. And if you have any questions, you can contact me. My Twitter is @jhaddix. I run a company that does red teaming, as well as I am the field CISO for Flare. If you want to check out Flare and their exposure management, it goes far beyond just the 4 levels I talked about. They also monitor GitHub and some other places where credentials end up getting stored, which is a fantastic thing that you need to do as an organization. It kind of fits inside that secrets management portion. But if you're interested in more, Flare actually has a free trial, which is how I got onto them. And just go to flare.io and start your free trial and check it out. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope it was useful, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Thanks so much.